Tonight, we're going inside a massive federal operation in Minneapolis, where ICE and the FBI say they dismantled a major fentanyl distribution.
At approximately 6:47 a.m. Central Time, Special Agent in Charge Victoria Chun stood before a wall of federal badges and delivered 6 words that would reshape everything Minneapolis thought it knew about itself. The cartel didn't infiltrate this city. They purchased it. What followed was the largest coordinated federal operation in Minnesota history. 412 arrests. 28 law enforcement officers in handcuffs, $53 million in cartel assets frozen, and 2.1 million fentanyl pills, enough to kill every man, woman, and child in the state twice over, pulled from the streets in a single night. But here is what the press conference did not tell you. This was not a drug bust. This was the dismantling of a shadow government that had operated beneath the frozen lakes and quiet neighborhoods of the Twin Cities for nearly a decade. And at its center sat a man whose name appeared on charity galas, economic development boards, and campaign contribution lists across the Midwest. His name was Raymond Castellanos. Fictional. Invented for this story. But the architecture of corruption he represents is terrifyingly real. Let me show you how deep it goes. And I promise you, the next part is worse. 4:32 a.m. Minneapolis, Minnesota. The temperature hovers at 14 degrees below zero, and the city sleeps beneath a thick blanket of silence and snow. Steam rises from manhole covers like breath from buried giants. The Mississippi River crawls black and slow beneath ice that groans in the darkness. On Hennepin Avenue, the neon signs of closed bars cast pink and blue shadows across empty sidewalks. In the warehouse district, a single security light flickers above a loading dock. And in the residential neighborhoods of North Minneapolis, not even the stray dogs are moving. This is the hour the federal government chose to strike. Across 17 locations scattered throughout the metropolitan area, 1,200 federal agents from the FBI, DEA, ICE, and DHS prepared to execute simultaneous breach operations. They had been staging for 6 hours in parking garages, abandoned buildings, and unmarked vehicles with their engines running and their radios silent. At 4:32 a.m. exactly, the command came through encrypted channels. Execute. In the Seward neighborhood, a SWAT team in black tactical gear moved on a 2-story house that had been under surveillance for 11 months. FBI intelligence had identified it as a primary fentanyl distribution hub, a place where Sinaloa cartel couriers transferred product to local street-level dealers. The breach took 9 seconds. Flashbangs shattered the frozen silence. The front door came off its hinges. 8 suspects were prone on the floor before they understood what was happening, their hands already being zip-tied behind their backs. In the first room alone, agents found 47 pounds of fentanyl powder, $300,000 in cash bound with rubber bands, and a small arsenal of weapons including 2 AR-15 rifles and a modified MAC-10. But the house was not what they had come for. In the basement, behind a false wall concealed by a water heater that had never been connected to plumbing, agents discovered a steel door. Behind that door was a room that did not exist on any building permit or property record. Inside were 17 encrypted servers, still running, still warm, still connected to a network that stretched far beyond Minneapolis. Simultaneously, in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, ICE and DEA teams hit a restaurant that had never served a single meal to a paying customer. The building's kitchen was spotless, its dining room tables still wrapped in plastic. But in the basement, agents found a fully operational pill press capable of producing 15,000 counterfeit oxycodone tablets per hour. Tablets that forensic analysis would later confirm contained lethal doses of fentanyl. In Brooklyn Park, federal agents raided a self-storage facility where they discovered an additional 1.8 million fentanyl pills hidden inside industrial equipment and children's toys. The storage units had been rented under the names of 17 different shell companies, all of which traced back to a single registered agent in Delaware. In Richfield, a team breached a modest split-level home owned by a man who had worked as a county vehicle inspector for 19 years. Inside his garage, they found ledgers. Handwritten records of every drug shipment that had entered Hennepin County through commercial trucking routes for the past 7 years. Routes that his position had allowed him to clear without inspection. By 5:15 a.m., 47 locations had been hit. 163 suspects were in federal custody. And the seizure count had already exceeded anything the Minneapolis field office had seen in its history. But the real discovery came at 5:47 a.m. In a nondescript office building in the North Loop, agents found a room that had been stripped of everything except a single laptop, still open, still logged into a secure communication portal. On the screen was a network diagram. Names, dates, dollar amounts. And at the top of the organizational chart, a code name. Operation Nordic Shadow. The FBI cyber forensics team arrived at 6:12 a.m. What they found on that laptop would take 17 weeks to fully decrypt and analyze. But within the first 3 hours, they understood the scope of what they were dealing with. This was not a drug trafficking operation. This was a systematic colonization of an American city by the Sinaloa cartel, executed with the knowing participation of elected officials, law enforcement personnel, and civic leaders. And the man at the center of it all was Deputy Mayor Raymond Castellanos. 9:47 a.m. FBI Field Office, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. Special Agent Marcus Webb had been with the Bureau for 22 years. He had worked cartel cases in Tucson, El Paso, and San Diego. He thought he understood how deep corruption could go. He was wrong. On the screens before him, analysts displayed the decoded contents of the Nordic Shadow servers. The network diagram looked like a nervous system, thousands of connections branching outward from a central node, each one representing a financial transaction, a communication, or a logistics coordination. The Sinaloa cartel had not simply established a presence in Minneapolis. They had built an infrastructure. 17 shell companies operated throughout the Twin Cities, each one designed to move money without triggering federal reporting requirements. The companies had legitimate-sounding names: Nordic Logistics Solutions, Prairie Wind Consulting, Heartland Investment Partners. They had offices with receptionists who answered phones. They had websites and LinkedIn profiles. They paid taxes. And every single one of them existed for one purpose: to launder drug money and integrate cartel revenue into the legitimate economy. The financial analysis revealed flows that spanned 4 continents. Money moved from Minneapolis to Panama, from Panama to the Cayman Islands, from the Caymans to shell corporations in Cyprus, and from Cyprus back to real estate investments in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas. Over the past 8 years, the network had laundered an estimated $470 million. But money was only one component. The servers also contained logistics data, shipping manifests, trucking schedules, warehouse inventories. The cartel had established a supply chain that moved fentanyl precursor chemicals from China to Mexico, processed product from Mexican superlabs to the United States, and distributed drugs from Minneapolis throughout the upper Midwest. The city's position made it perfect. Minneapolis sat at the intersection of major interstate highways connecting the coasts. It had rail connections, river access, and an international airport. It was close enough to the Canadian border to provide escape routes, but far enough from the southern border to avoid the concentrated federal attention that plagued Texas and Arizona. The cartel had identified Minneapolis as an ideal hub, and then they had set about making it theirs. The key was Raymond Castellanos. Deputy Mayor Castellanos had been a fixture in Minneapolis politics for 15 years. He had served on the city council, chaired the Economic Development Committee, and positioned himself as a champion of business growth and urban renewal. His name appeared on the donor lists of 3 different charitable foundations. His photograph hung in the lobbies of community centers he had helped fund. And according to the Nordic Shadow files, he had been on the Sinaloa cartel payroll since 2017. His encrypted authorization key appeared on logistics documents coordinating shipment routes. His digital signature authenticated wire transfers to cartel-controlled accounts. His personal email contained communications with individuals the DEA had identified as senior cartel logistics coordinators. Raymond Castellanos had not been corrupted by the cartel. He had been their architect from the beginning. "This is not corruption," Agent Webb said, staring at the screen. "This is command-level collusion. This man didn't take bribes. He designed the operation." The evidence showed that Castellanos had used his position to facilitate cartel expansion at every level. He had influenced zoning decisions to allow the construction of warehouse facilities that served as drug distribution centers. He had directed city contracts to shell companies that laundered cartel money. He had intervened in police hiring decisions to ensure that cartel-connected individuals secured positions in sensitive units. And he had done it all while attending ribbon-cutting ceremonies and speaking at community forums about making Minneapolis safe. The FBI cyber team continued decrypting files throughout the morning. Each new layer revealed additional tentacles of the operation. A network of massage parlors that served as fronts for human trafficking. A trucking company that moved migrants from the southern border to labor camps in rural Minnesota. A series of convenience stores that functioned as cash integration points for street-level drug revenue. By noon, the scope had become clear. The Sinaloa cartel had not infiltrated Minneapolis. They had colonized it. And the operation was still incomplete. Encrypted files revealed the next phase of Nordic Shadow, a plan to expand operations into St. Paul, Duluth, Rochester, and eventually establish corridor control from Minneapolis to Chicago. The goal was not simply profit. The goal was territorial dominance. The cartel intended to transform the Upper Midwest into a secure distribution empire, insulated from federal interference by a network of corrupted officials, compromised law enforcement, and legitimate business facades. If they had succeeded, the region would have become a narco-state within a state. The FBI briefing concluded at 12:47 p.m. with a single directive: expand the operation. 5:15 a.m. the following morning. Federal Coordination Center, Fort Snelling, Minnesota. On a digital map of the Upper Midwest, 47 red markers pulsed across 6 states. Each marker represented a Nordic shadow asset, a property, a business, a warehouse, a residence, a bank account, that federal investigators had identified through the seized server data. The cartel network extended far beyond Minneapolis. It reached into Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. It connected to trucking routes that stretched to the coasts. It interfaced with port operations in Duluth and Chicago. It maintained communication links with cartel leadership in Culiacan, Mexico. Operation Cold Harvest was authorized at 5:23 a.m. The largest coordinated federal action in Midwest history deployed over 2,000 agents from the FBI, DEA, ICE, DHS, U.S. Marshals, and ATF across the 6-state region. Black Hawk helicopters staged at National Guard facilities in 3 states. Armored vehicles positioned at key intersections. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter moved into position on Lake Superior to intercept any waterborne escape attempts. At 6 a.m. exactly, the raids began. In Rochester, Minnesota, agents hit a medical supply warehouse that had been shipping fentanyl alongside legitimate pharmaceutical products for 3 years. They seized 400 pounds of fentanyl powder and arrested the facility's operations manager, a man who had coached Little League Baseball and served as a deacon at his church. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, SWAT teams breached a ranch property that intelligence indicated served as a waypoint for human trafficking operations. They found 17 women from Central America locked in a barn, awaiting transport to labor sites in North Dakota. The women had been promised jobs in food processing. Instead, they had been sold. In Fargo, North Dakota, ICE agents raided a network of apartments that housed undocumented workers who had been smuggled across the border and forced into debt bondage at agricultural operations. The workers owed their smugglers thousands of dollars and had been told their families in Guatemala and Honduras would be harmed if they attempted to leave. In Madison, Wisconsin, FBI teams arrested a state legislator who had received campaign contributions from Nordic shadow shell companies. His office contained documents showing he had intervened to prevent regulatory inspections of trucking companies that moved cartel product. In Des Moines, Iowa, agents seized a server farm that had provided encrypted communication services for cartel logistics coordination across the entire network. By noon, the operation had produced 319 additional arrests, seized an additional $68 million in assets, and recovered evidence that would fuel federal prosecutions for years. But the most significant arrests occurred back in Minneapolis. At 7:23 a.m., FBI agents arrived at the downtown condominium of Deputy Mayor Raymond Castellanos. He was still in his bathrobe, coffee cup in hand, when they showed him the warrant. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply nodded, set down his coffee, and extended his wrists for the handcuffs. As agents led him to the elevator, one of them, a young agent on his first major operation, asked him why. Castellanos smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who had known this moment would eventually come. "You think you stopped something," he said. "You stopped a phase. The system will rebuild. It always does." The elevator doors closed. The exposure of law enforcement corruption proved to be the most devastating element of Operation Cold Harvest. Over the following weeks, federal investigators analyzed the seized records to identify every law enforcement officer, government employee, and public official who had been compromised by the cartel network. The numbers were staggering. 28 Minneapolis police officers had received payments from cartel-connected sources. Their roles varied. Some had simply looked the other way during drug transactions. Others had actively provided intelligence on federal investigation activities. A few had participated directly in protecting shipments and eliminating rival dealers. 7 Hennepin County Sheriff's deputies had falsified patrol records to create gaps in coverage that allowed cartel convoys to move without observation. 3 Minnesota State Patrol officers had been providing advance warning of checkpoint operations along Interstate 94. 2 ICE agents, federal agents, sworn to protect the nation's borders, had been feeding information about immigration enforcement actions to cartel human trafficking coordinators. And a federal judge in the District of Minnesota had been systematically issuing lenient sentences to cartel-connected defendants who came before her court. The scope of infiltration extended into civic institutions as well. school board members who had facilitated money laundering through youth sports programs, health inspectors who had cleared cartel-front businesses without inspection, city planners who had approved construction permits for distribution facilities. The cartel had not simply bribed individuals. They had colonized institutions. For the honest officers who had served alongside the compromised, the revelation was devastating. Sergeant Elena Vasquez had worked narcotics for 12 years. She had lost 2 partners to cartel violence. She had spent countless nights away from her children, believing she was making the city safer. Now she learned that 3 members of her own unit had been feeding information to the organization she had dedicated her career to fighting. "I trusted them," she said during a debriefing session. "I trusted them with my life." We all did. The betrayal extended beyond individual relationships. It undermined the very foundation of public trust that law enforcement depends upon. If citizens cannot believe that police are working for them rather than against them, the social contract fractures. Federal investigators determined that the cartel had invested approximately $12 million annually in law enforcement corruption within the Minneapolis metropolitan area alone. The return on that investment was estimated at several $100 million in protected drug revenue. The math was simple. Corruption was profitable. Rebuilding would require more than arrests. It would require a complete restructuring of how law enforcement operated in the region. The Minneapolis Police Department announced that every officer would undergo integrity screening. The Hennepin County Sheriff's Office implemented new financial disclosure requirements. The Minnesota State Patrol established a dedicated internal affairs unit to investigate potential cartel connections. But trust, once broken, does not repair easily. The Nordic Shadow operation revealed something that extends far beyond Minneapolis. The Sinaloa cartel's Minnesota network was not unique. It was a model. A template that intelligence agencies believe has been replicated in cities across the country. Cities that lack the border focus of Texas or Arizona, cities where residents believe cartel activity is someone else's problem. The fentanyl that Nordic Shadow distributed killed an estimated 417 people in Minnesota during its years of operation. 417 individuals who believed the pills they purchased were pharmaceutical products, not cartel-manufactured poison. Many of them were young. Many of them had families who had no idea they were struggling with addiction. Many of them died alone, in bedrooms and bathrooms and parked cars, their bodies growing cold before anyone found them. The human trafficking operations that Nordic Shadow facilitated moved approximately 2,000 individuals through Minnesota over 5 years. Some were exploited for labor. Some were exploited for sex. All of them were treated as commodities, their humanity erased by the economics of criminal enterprise. The money laundering operations corrupted legitimate businesses, distorted real estate markets, and integrated criminal proceeds so deeply into the regional economy that untangling them will take years. And the political corruption demonstrated that no institution is immune. Not city government. Not county government. Not state legislatures. Not federal agencies. Raymond Castellanos did not see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a businessman. A facilitator. A connector between interests that needed each other. The cartel needed legitimacy. The city needed investment. He provided the bridge. That is how corruption often works. Not through obvious villainy, but through rationalization. Through small compromises that become large ones. Through the gradual erosion of principles until nothing remains but self-interest dressed in respectable clothing. If you are still watching, I need you to understand something. This story is fictional. The names, the specific events, the precise details, they were created for this narrative. Raymond Castellanos does not exist. Operation Nordic Shadow is an invention. But the architecture of what I have described is real. Cartel operations in American cities are real. Political corruption is real. Law enforcement infiltration is real. The fentanyl crisis that kills tens of thousands of Americans every year is real. The Minneapolis I described could be any city. It could be your city. It could be the place where you raise your children, where you go to work, where you trust that the institutions protecting you are actually working in your interest. The lesson of Nordic Shadow, the fictional lesson that reflects real patterns, is that power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it announces itself with charity galas and economic development initiatives. Sometimes it wears a suit and speaks about community investment. Sometimes it smiles at ribbon-cutting ceremonies while directing drug shipments from a phone in its pocket. The defense against this kind of infiltration is not simply law enforcement. It is civic awareness. It is asking questions about where money comes from. It is demanding transparency from public officials. It is refusing to accept that corruption is inevitable or that fighting it is someone else's responsibility. The 412 people arrested in Operation Cold Harvest represented only the visible portion of a network that had spent years building invisible influence. For every person in handcuffs, there were collaborators who escaped detection, systems that remained compromised, and patterns that will take generations to correct. $53 million in seized assets will not resurrect the 417 people killed by Nordic Shadow fentanyl. Arresting 28 corrupt officers will not restore the trust that communities place in the badges meant to protect them. Prosecuting Raymond Castellanos will not undo the years he spent transforming a city into a cartel logistics hub. What happened in this fictional Minneapolis could happen anywhere. It may already be happening. And the only way to prevent it is to refuse the comfortable assumption that it cannot happen here. Because the cartels are counting on that assumption. They are counting on your belief that corruption is a problem for other places, other people, other communities. They are counting on your distraction, your exhaustion, your willingness to look away. And every time you do, they advance another inch. If this story resonated with you, tap like so more people see it. Comment expose if you believe these patterns of corruption should be dragged into the light. Share this with someone who needs to understand how these operations work. And remember, this was fiction. But the warning it carries is very, very real. The battle for American cities is not always fought with guns and badges. Sometimes it is fought with shell companies and campaign contributions and quiet meetings where no one asks too many questions. The question is not whether corruption exists. The question is what we do about it.